I'm happy to be back. I'm so happy to be back in the Parsha. I have to say, I feel a little. We've been off for 2 weeks now because of the Passover break, and because there is no Parsha, we read special Passover readings. And actually, if you check out my podcast, we did an episode on one of those readings. So there's definitely Torah to study during the holiday, but it's a good time to take a couple weeks off. And I've been off. I was in Israel, and that was a real blessing. So I was grateful for the time off, but I'm very glad to be back in this. I feel a little unmoored if I'm not studying the Parsha. This is really my anchor. So I'm grateful to see you all. I'm grateful to begin our study, our weekly study again. I want to start, and I've said this sometime before, but it certainly needs saying today. To borrow a term of our age, I want to start with a trigger warning because we are going to discuss this. This is really necessary today because our topic today is incest. Okay, so just if that's an uncomfortable topic for you to think about for an hour, this is probably not the right class. And I say and that will also eventually bring up questions of rape and other kinds of sexual manipulation inevitably. So it's a heavy topic today, and so I warn, but I also want to just warn you that there's no way that we'll really do this topic justice. There's no way we'll get to the bottom of this. There's no way we're going to cover or encompass. And I also just want to apologize in advance if our conversation veers in any way that feels muddled or confusing or even problematic. It's a dangerous topic, and I may stumble here and there, and we'll try to correct each other along the way if that happens. But it is an important topic for us to consider as we head now into this Parsha. This Parsha is Acharei, and Acharei has in it the list of sexual prohibitions that we've come to call in Jewish tradition the arayot. And the translation for arayot is not sexual prohibitions, but literally nakednesses. Okay, so we're going to be looking at the nakednesses that are listed in the Torah, and it's important that we do, even if it is an uncomfortable topic, and even if the moral, and this is one of the great Jewish conversations of our age, even if the sexual morality that we find in the Torah diverges from the sexual morality of our community and our age, certainly we'll come across that kind of tension. But it's important that we do because it is really one of the huge classic Jewish legal conversations. It is thought to be one of the sexual prohibitions are thought to be one of the primary cardinal sins that one can commit in Jewish law: murder, idolatry, and what's called gilui arayot, which literally means the uncovering of nakedness or nakednesses, right? That's sort of a funny word, but actually is the most precise translation. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. And with those warnings and caveats in place, let's get started. Before we just say a blessing here, do I have an administrator? Has anyone hopped on? No. Okay, that's fine. Everybody hearing me fine and everything going fine in terms of, and I've enabled the captions for my mother, who I see here, and I see them. Does everybody see the captions? No. Okay. Yes, some people. I usually don't see them, and I do see them today, but it's fine with me as long as it's fine with everyone else. They're there to be enabled for those who need them. It's one of the great blessings of Zoom and of this strange online period that we've been in, that my mother is able to be here and learn with us because of these captions, but I don't know exactly how the administrator usually turns them on. So anyway, there they are. All right, I also have one more caveat, which is just that I haven't taught a class now in 2 weeks, and I got to get back into the rhythm. So I'm a little jet lagged and a little wobbly on my feet in general. So bear with me, and hopefully together we'll have a deep investigation into our sacred text. So let's say a blessing, bring some sanctity into this very delicate conversation that we're going to try and have. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay, so incest, or sometimes incest is a bit of a moral word. The more technical term often is consanguinity, right? The mating with those who are blood relatives. Though incest sometimes refers to other kinds of forbidden sexual unions, familial sexual unions, by way of marriage or adoption, or in some cases even nursing from the same nursemaid. Now, there are various standards for what actually constitutes incest. But before we even go there, what I want to start by doing is to justify a little bit why it is that we're looking today at incest and not any of the other sexual prohibitions that are listed in chapter 18 of the book of Leviticus. Because when I speak of sexual prohibitions in Judaism, we often think most prominently of adultery, which is one of the 10 commandments. And that is also in this list. And these days, one of the most important and difficult conversations that we have in the Jewish community is the reevaluation of another sexual prohibition, which is the prohibition on gay male sex, which is also in this list. And surely that either of those topics requires a whole hour at least unto itself to consider. We're not going to go there today, just too much to do, but also I want to give a little bit of a textual justification for why we can consider what I'm going to ask us to do today, which is to consider the prohibitions on incest in particular, and not to think about or not to associate them with some of those other sexual prohibitions. And the justification that I want to give is actually textual. And I want to show you something that I don't think that we've considered before in this class. And as I was reading up on this class, I read an essay by one of really, I think, the great Parsha thinkers in our world today, who is Rav Elchanan Samet. He's a rabbi in Israel. And unfortunately, his work is not available in English. But one of the things that he read an essay on this topic in his book, and one of the things that he does often and that he did here was to give us an analysis of, and as I said, this is something we haven't covered before in this class. We look at the language of the Torah. We look at the context of the Torah. We look at repeating patterns and stories in the Torah. But one thing I don't think we've spent a lot of time looking at in our study is the tradition of the writing of the Torah in paragraphs, little separated paragraphs that are either ptuchot, open, or stumot, closed. In other words, when you look at a scroll of the Torah, you'll see there are breaks, and some of those breaks are an entire line, and that's called an open break because it's a bigger break. And then there are smaller breaks, a closed break, but still a break that looks more like what we think of as a tab, right? In the way we type today, and it's like a few spaces to separate one paragraph from another. Now, having said that, Rev Elchanan Samet points out that the list of sexual prohibitions in chapter 18 of the book of Leviticus can be divided into two parts. And the first part is the prohibitions on incest or consanguinity. And the second chunk contains some of these other prohibitions, like the prohibition of adultery and like the prohibition of male homosexual sex. And I just want to show you how this works, both because I want to justify our leaving aside that second half, but also because for me, that was actually a helpful elucidation to realize that there actually may be different sexual codes in the Torah. And as we reevaluate some, we can actually do some of the separating work and thinking about why incest has its own sexual code and that is not in fact related to some of those other sexual prohibitions. So let me show you what I mean. And with this, I'll give you, let's see here. With this, I will give you a link to today's source sheet. So now this is a very famous chapter. We read it, we don't do this at Acharei, mostly because of the jarring nature of the appearance of the prohibition on homosexuality in a community where we affirm homosexual relationships and unions. But this is actually classically the one of the readings from the Torah on Yom Kippur, right? To avoid sexual, on a day where we sort of abstain from bodily pleasures, or some kind of reminder of the way that bodily pleasures can spin out of control or immoral practices of the body. So anyway, this is the chapter that is sometimes read in communities on Yom Kippur. It's chapter 8 of Leviticus. And I want to, as I said, give you a little bit of a look into why we might say that the incest prohibitions are separate from some of the other sexual mandates of the Torah. So let's take a look here. Chapter 18. Now, we're going to read through verse 17 here, and you can see in verse we start the incest prohibitions here in verse 6, and you can see over here, if you look in the Torah, there's a marker with a samech after the verse, if it's going to be a stuma break, meaning a kind of a closer or closed break, and that's what this looks like here, this break here, okay? And there's one actually after every verse in the list of incest prohibitions. So that's interesting. There's clearly a kind of a pattern and a grouping that even if you don't know Hebrew, you can just follow these little notations and see one verse after another, break, break, break. It's as if there is a kind of a list, a bulleted list, you might say, of all of these prohibitions, right? And then after the last one, there's a break, and then all of the other sexual prohibitions, that is the ones that have to do with adultery or menstruation or homosexual sex or bestiality, all of those are in one big chunk of a paragraph, okay? So that is just important information for us, because these seem to be operating differently or separately from the list above. And we will not be considering them today, though they, of course, deserve a fuller treatment. Today, we're just going to look at the first listing here that, again, is broken up in a particular way. Okay. So, okay, let's now take a step back. And again, now we're going to head into the topic of incest in the Torah. And we need yet more kind of introduction before we actually look at the text. Different societies have different standards for what constitutes incest, what constitutes forbidden familial sexual relationships, but it is an almost universal prohibition. That is, almost all human cultures have some notion of consanguinity, of forbidden familial relationships, though they differ from culture to culture what exactly constitutes incest. Probably the most varying relationship is that of cousins. And in fact, and I say this in part because in fact, as we'll soon see in Jewish law, cousins, even first cousins, are not forbidden to have sexual relationships. I have to say, in my family, not too many generations back, first cousins married. And that's true in many cultures, though not in all cultures. Some cultures do prohibit, and there are even variations among, as I was reading up for this, I read that in ancient China, first cousins through the father's side could not be sexually related, but through the mother's side, they could. Okay, so there are variations from culture to culture over what constitutes incest, but the idea of incest is a rather universal prohibition, and that's part of the reason why I wanted to really take time to separate out these prohibitions from some of the other sexual mores that the Torah presents, because those other sexual mores have much more cultural variation, whereas incest is remarkably consistent from culture to culture. Again, there are variations, and another variation is the prohibition of siblings being sexually related, which is forbidden in Jewish law, but is not in some cultures, and this will be very important for us, was not forbidden in ancient Egypt. Although I don't know the ancient Egyptian code so well, and I think there's some question of like whether the brother was older or younger, but Cleopatra, for example, was married to, or one of the Cleopatras was married to her brother. Okay, so that was permitted, especially in ancient Egyptian royalty, and is often found in royal families as a way of keeping the royalty within the family. Okay, and that may be relevant to our investigation today. So siblings forbidden in Jewish law and many cultures, but not in all cultures. Almost universally, I didn't find any exception. Sexual relationships between parents and children are forbidden. Okay, now the question is why? Why are they forbidden? And as I said at the outset, no way we're going to do a thorough and sufficient explanation for that. But let me just name some of the common and obvious explanations, which are, one, biological. Like maybe this is an evolutionary instinct because there isn't enough genetic material. It's what we call inbreeding. If families have sexual relationships, and the offspring from those families will eventually be deficient and can produce birth defects. So that's one explanation. Although not all incest prohibitions can be explained away in that way, right? There are some prohibitions that don't seem that some cultures have that don't seem like they would be biologically necessary, and then there are cultures that ignore those biological considerations. There is, of course, and we'll probably think a lot about this together, psychological explanations, just the psychological damage that can be done when someone who is your caretaker or your close trusted family relationship, when that relationship becomes sexualized, we might say that is a natural psychological damage, like that anyone would be damaged by that. Although now we're in the realm of debate and discussion and what would constitute psychological damage, and there are cultures, or at least cultural arguments, that say that this is a victimless crime, right? That if two siblings want to be together, who are we to say that is psychologically destructive? Okay, so and then of course we might offer sociological reasons, and there begin just talk about the stability of family or tribal units and the way that competing sexual relationships might undermine some of that stability. Okay, so that's just to name some of the basic arguments for the prohibitions of incest. Okay, what we're going to try and do while keeping those in mind is just to look at the text of the Torah and just try to understand what does the language of the Torah seem to be saying to us And we're just going to do what we always do in this class, which is to just try to be good, keen interpreters of the Torah. We'll look at the text itself, and then we'll, as we often do, we'll try to note whether this text can be better understood by connecting it in the context of the whole Torah to other moments in the narrative and of our tradition. Okay, that was a lot of introduction, but as you can tell, I'm a little nervous even going into this topic. All right, here we are. So let's take a look. The forbidden relationships that let me list them before we look at them. That the Torah lists here at the beginning of chapter 18 are parents and children, right? Also parents and stepchildren, step-parents and stepchildren, okay? Which that is not consanguinity, that's not a blood relationship, but the Torah forbids that as well. Siblings are forbidden to be sexually intimate, and step-siblings, okay? Grandchildren, the Torah list doesn't go any further than that, but children and grandchildren. Now, here's an interesting one. Speaking of blips and differences in cultures and their prohibition. I already said that cousins are permitted to be sexually intimate in Jewish law. It is forbidden for an aunt and a nephew to be sexually intimate, but not for an uncle and a niece. Why that is, we can think about together, but I will just name one potential obvious reason why that might be, which is that Abraham was married to his niece, Sarah. Okay, so maybe it's just like, well, we can't say that because that would delegitimize the first Jewish relationship. Children's spouses are forbidden in this list, and sibling spouses as well. Okay, so I think that roughly covers it. So we'll read through it together and then begin to open up a little bit for your thinking and explanation and interpretation. So now let's take a look. Here we're going to begin. There we go. Everybody see this? We good? Okay. Okay, the introduction here is very important, and this our conversation may begin and end with this introduction because the framing of these prohibitions is quite striking. God spoke to Moses, Adonai spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the Israelite people and say to them, I am Adonai, your God. You shall not copy the practices of the land of Egypt where you dwelt, or of the land of Canaan to which I am taking you, nor shall you follow in their ways. My law alone shall you observe, and faithfully follow my rules. I am Hashem, your God. You shall keep my laws and my rules, by the pursuit of which human beings shall live. I am Adonai." There's some famous phrasing here, which I'll just point out in the Hebrew. You shall not copy the practices of the land of Egypt or the land of Canaan, nor shall you follow in their ways. The language there is uvechukotehem lo telechu. Do not walk in their chukim. And the word for chukim, some of you may know, are rules, not necessarily justice, but just the rules of that society. Okay, the ways and customs of that society. Okay, you might say the codes of conduct. You might even say the culture of that society. Okay, chukotehem. The other phrase that I want to point out here, which is very famous, is you shall keep my laws and my rules, by the pursuit of which human beings shall live. And the language here is ushmartem et chukotai. You shall observe my rules. Ve'et mishpatai, and my justice, my law, asher yaseh otam, because if you do them, asher yaseh otam ha'adam v'chai bahem, you will live through them. They will, and this phrase is worth keeping in mind because it's really been considered by the tradition. These are life-giving laws. So what might that mean here? I am God. Okay, these are the verses that we're going to look at most closely today. verses 6 and 7. No man shall come near anyone of his own flesh to uncover nakedness. Ish el kol sher basaro lo tikrevu legalot erva. That phrase in particular, to uncover nakedness. And that word is our key word today, erva, ani Adonai. Okay, that's an introductory sentence. And then the first phrasing, which will become kind of a template for the rest, is the verse we're going to pay particular attention to. The nakedness of your father and the nakedness of your mother you shall not uncover. She is your mother, you shall not uncover her nakedness. Ervat avicha ve'ervat imcha lo tegale, imchahi lo tegale ervata. Now, that's a confusing sentence because it looks like you shall not, and the Torah seems to be speaking to men, to a male listener, right? No man. So it seems like the Torah is saying you shall not uncover the nakedness of your father or your mother, but then it doubles down on your mother. So some people read this to be equivalent to what we read in the next verse, which is the nakedness of your father's wife you shall not uncover. It is the nakedness of your father. Okay, those are different phrasings. The nakedness of your father's wife you shall not uncover. Now, is that your mother? In which case, it's just sort of a repetition of what was said above. In which case, the nakedness of your father is just the earlier phrasing of what the next verse calls the nakedness of your father. Is the nakedness of your mother, does that belong to your father and therefore you can't look at it because it's his? Or is this first verse saying you can't look at your father's nakedness or your mother's nakedness, which is the way it reads, and that's quite striking because it would suggest that not just the Torah is not just presuming relationships between men and women, but potentially sexual relationships between sons and fathers as well. Okay, so this is a little confusing, but this is the language that we're going to hear for the rest of this passage. I'm going to read just through to verse 17, and then finally going to open up the class. And I want to hear why. What is the reason here why you should not do these things? So I'll start again at verse 6. No man shall come near anyone of his own flesh, kol she'er basaro, to uncover nakedness. I am God, I am Hashem. The nakedness of your father and the nakedness of your mother you shall not uncover. She's your mother. You shall not uncover her nakedness. The nakedness of your father's wife you shall not uncover. It is the nakedness of your father. The nakedness of your sister, your father's daughter, or your mother's, whether born into the household or outside, do not uncover their nakedness. The nakedness of your son's daughter or of your daughter's daughter, do not uncover their nakedness, for the nakedness is yours. That's strange. Now that's a little different because it seemed like we could have read the earlier verse to mean, oh, that nakedness belongs to your father. But here it says the nakedness is yours, that is your grandchildren, don't uncover it. Okay. The nakedness of your father's wife's daughter, who was born into your father's household, she is your sister, do not uncover her nakedness. The nakedness of your father's sister, you shall not uncover. She is your father's flesh. The nakedness of your mother's sister, you shall not uncover, for she is your mother's flesh. Those were the aunts, but notice they're not talking about uncles, or in this case, nieces. The nakedness of your father's brother, you shall not uncover. Do not approach his wife. She is your aunt. Do not uncover the nakedness of your daughter-in-law. She is your son's wife. You shall not uncover her nakedness. And finally, do not uncover the nakedness of your brother's wife. It is the nakedness of your brother. Okay. And that one is not a blood relationship. It is a marriage prohibition. Okay. Okay, very confusing stuff, right? And I've done a lot of talking. I've been talking for now half the class. So I'm having problems here today with, I think because I was the host, my screen keeps jiggling around. Okay, let's begin. What are we seeing here? Why does the Torah not want you to do these things that, after all, most societies don't want you to do? So I'm partially asking, why do most societies not have this prohibition? But that's too big a question. So let's try to answer the question, why does the Torah seem to prohibit it? Okay, let's start with Matt Silberstein.
I'm not even
Matt,
sure I'm ready to get there. What's that?
Can we see you today?
Oh, sure. My phone was
We
moving
love
around.
your face, Matt. You're never required to show your face. I know people sometimes have privacy stuff, but it's always nice.
Okay. I'm holding my phone up and down instead of sideways.
Appreciate it.
Okay. I'm not even sure I'm ready to get to that because I'm just trying to understand what I'm looking at. And what I think I'm seeing is I'm seeing it as bubbles. This is a person that matters. There's a prohibition around that person. Here's a person that matters. There's a prohibition around. And I just also wonder, are they trying to say, here are all the cases and they miss some? Or are they leaving them out deliberately? It almost feels to me like they're trying to say, here's all of them, and they've just forgotten some because there's so many permutations. They don't mean to leave some out. They want to say this. So I'm not even sure I'm ready to get to why.
Okay. You posed to us a great question. Is this meant to be a comprehensive list? These are the prohibited unions. All other unions are permitted, or are we being told it is bad to have sexual relationships amongst the family, whether blood relatives or through marriage? Just avoid that. And we can assume that applies to great grandchildren as well. And we can assume that should apply to cousins as well. And we should assume after all, the list seems to be speaking to a male listener. So the same thing would apply to a female listener thinking about relationships with men. Okay, so that's a good question. Noah.
Yeah, it's a very interesting list, specifically the nuclear family, the father, mother, and the descendants. And then going further, I think it would equally apply to the daughters of Zelophehad, because they then got the inheritance and thus the laws were incumbent on them. Though I'm thinking that the Levirite marriage and all those permutations just throw a whole wrench into this, because it just throws a lot of this out the window, and keeping that family name alive then seems to be more important. The father's last name or the brother's last name or whoever's last name it is the one seemingly being kept alive.
Yeah, these are great questions that you're raising. Noah asks us to consider how much these prohibitions have to do with the laws of inheritance and preservation of the family name, right? And that does become relevant in all kinds of ways, both in the case that that Noah mentions of the daughters of Zelophehad, who are wondering what happens when the Torah seems to have presumed that only males carry on the family inheritance and name, and eventually the Torah corrects that. So might we understand that move to mean that, yes, this was taking into account the way that a family preserves its name and inheritance? And so you might imagine that the marriages within families, competitions for who will be the inheritor, would get far too complicated if people were allowed to, oh, well, why don't I just marry my brother and then I'll also have the inheritance? And so when the Torah corrects for what seems to be only men inheriting, right? It complements the idea that we can keep the family sexually separate and continue the laws of, and in fact, we should. And Noah also mentions a very important kind of asterisk, caveat, strange exception to all of this, which is the law of yibum. Yibum. Actually, in Daf Yomi right now, they're studying these laws. And the law of yibum, what they call the Levirite marriage, is when your brother is married to someone, you are not allowed to have sexual relationships with that woman. When you, a man, have a brother and your brother has a wife, as my brother does, right? That is forbidden. But if that brother dies without children, you are obligated then to marry that woman and to have children with her in order to carry on your brother's name. Those children will be known as your brother's children and not yours. So you can see that Noah is very keenly pointing out the ways that these sorts of relationships implicate the preservation of a family name. And in that case, you can break what seems to be the earlier law in order to preserve the family name. But in most cases, you wouldn't marry that person, and partially it is to keep separate the lineage of your brother and the lineage of you within the family. Okay, so those considerations as well. Payam.
I just have a question. Is this the same language that's used in Noah? About
Payam, wow, you're today's genius. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So I think now, and after all, our hour is running. So let's go there and let's introduce now. We've got a line of interpreters. I know there's much more to say on just what we've read already, but Payam makes the connection, the kind of striking connection that I wanted to make today. You stole my thunder, and that's the best possible outcome. So here, take a look at this. We often do this in this class. Here we're presented with this strange language of uncovering nakedness. Why put it that way? How about just don't sleep with your daughter? Don't sleep with your mother. How about that language? But instead, it's uncovering nakedness. And Payam is right that the place where we find that language for the first time in the Torah, in fact, the place where we find this word erva for the first time in the Torah is in the Noah story. And this is, so let's take a look at that and see if we can incorporate it into our thinking, because sure, the connection is that Payam is suggesting is so obvious linguistically that it must inform our conversation. So let's take a look. This is after Noah saves the world, okay? Noah saves, or at least the animals and his family. A lot of other people died in the process, but Noah saves all the animals and restarts humanity. And that seems significant. Noah's there to kind of restart humanity. And the first thing that Noah does, though, after he saves the world, it's sort of a tragic story, is he gets drunk. He gets drunk. Okay, and we can understand how traumatizing his experience might have been, but let's take a look at what happens there. Boy, my screen sharing is really messed up today. Okay. Noah, the tiller of the soil, was the first to plant a vineyard. He drank from the wine and became drunk, and he uncovered himself within his tent. Vayitgal, same language of gilui. He uncovered himself within his tent. And then Ham, the father of Canaan, remember that's one of the forbidden nations, right? You're not supposed to imitate their practices, saw the nakedness of his father, Ervat Aviv, and he told his two brothers outside. What does it mean that he saw the nakedness of his father? Well, let's read to the end, and then we'll think about it a little bit. But Shem and Yafet took a cloth, placed it against both their backs, and walking backward, they covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned the other way so that they did not see the nakedness of their father. When Noah woke up from his wine and learned what his youngest son had done to him, he said, "Cursed be Canaan, cursed be your son. The lowest of slaves shall he be to his brothers." Okay, there's a lot here, but let me just say two things quickly, and then actually I want to return to Payam and see if he has anything to make of this. Same language, same exact language that we really only find in this story and then in our chapter in Leviticus of uncovering nakedness. revealing nakedness. Okay, but it doesn't seem to be a sexual relationship. It seems like he just saw his father's nakedness. So one question we might ask is, what was so bad about that? What's so bad about seeing your parents naked? Is that bad? What's so bad about this? And the other sons seem to know that it's bad, and they cover their father's nakedness, and they don't see their father's nakedness. Okay, but in part because the Noah seems to be very, very upset, and he learned what his youngest son had done. What does his youngest son do to him? The commentaries suggest exactly what you might think they would suggest. Here's Rashi, our foremost commentator. Saw the nakedness of his father. Some say that he castrated him, and some say that he raped him. Okay? Very chilling commentary there. But the connection between those two stories is, in the methodology that we use in this class, it's obvious. It's undeniable. Their language of uncovering nakedness, which is such strange language to begin with, is rooted somehow in that Noah story. And again, I'll repeat, you don't follow the practices of Egypt, where I told you siblings married, and you don't follow the practices of Canaan, which is the cursed nation in the story of Noah. So, Payam, do you have any further thoughts on that? You've already done us a lot of good just by making the connection, but any thoughts there?
I think it's different. I mean, well, it's sort of, I think it's more, I've never liked the Rashi. I think it's more about vulnerability. I think it's more about seeing something that's defective in his father, and that certain things should be secret. And that, okay. So he saw that. And then when you talk about uncovering, which is a different act, it's creating that in your whatever familiar relation person.
Excellent. Okay, good. So Payam raises two important themes for us to consider. And I'm just going to repeat myself. Look, it's 12:45. There's no way we're going to do full justice to this topic. But as we look at the Torah's context, let's consider these two themes that Payam raises. One is some sense of privacy, just sort of bodily privacy and shame around the revelation of the body. Is that part of it? And there are just certain people you shouldn't see naked in the family, right? And the other thing is vulnerability. Noah was drunk. He was inebriated. Whatever Ham did to him, whether we follow the rabbinic commentaries or whether it's just that he observed his father. Remember, he didn't uncover his father's nakedness. Noah uncovered his own nakedness, but Noah was drunk and reeling in his tent, and there's something predatory about even the looking at his father in this state. So he's taken advantage of his father's inebriated state. Okay, so that may be relevant. Okay, that's the story of Noah, but start to think about, is that part of what we're thinking about when we're thinking about family relationships in the book of Leviticus? Are we thinking about the ways in which families live together? So how will they maintain privacy, right? Like, you share a house with your children. When they begin to develop sexually, is it time to have separate quarters of the house? Is that important so that sexuality isn't evoked, right? And you share a household with your family. Some members of that family are more powerful than others, right? In this case, it's the father who's vulnerable, but usually it's the children who are vulnerable. Don't take advantage of that vulnerability. Okay, so those are important connections to draw. And the Noah story is clearly doing something to our understanding of Gilui Arayot. This becomes the famous phrase, revealing nakedness, and it starts in the story of Noah. So great job, Payam. My mother. At the beginning of class, you showed, one paragraph that you showed, one sentence I didn't understand the English. What does it mean to say, don't uncover? What do we, don't uncover? So what is that phrase? What is that phrase? Don't uncover. Good question. Good question. It doesn't sound like sex, right? That's one of the strangest things in this famous chapter. It doesn't sound like it's talking about sex. It sounds like it's talking about not seeing something. And Noah himself got naked, but there's some suggestion that maybe you would take off the clothes of someone in your family. Look at them. Try to get underneath their clothing, right? So what does that mean? Why that phrasing? So part of it is it comes from the Noah story, but why is that an important idea? Not to uncover and see nakedness, right? So just the phrasing itself, what is that? What does that mean? Why is that important? Great question. Okay, Richard. Richard, I can't hear you. I still can't hear you. Richard? Not working? Oh, that's a shame. Okay, anyone else here, Richard? No. Okay, Ariella?
Well, as Richard said in the comments, that uncovering nakedness can lead to rape and other dominating of vulnerable people that shouldn't be. And well, and that shouldn't be is my own judgment. But I think in the Bible, it said to protect the unit of the family, because families have to coexist. And once there are, one person dominates another or is inappropriate, that takes the balance out of how the family is supposed to function.
Okay, all right. All right, so Ariel is saying two separate things. First of all, thanks for bringing Richard's words into the conversation, though he couldn't speak them out loud. That there is, and this begins to answer the question my mother was just raising. Why, Anka? What's the big deal with uncovering? And it seemed one way to interpret that is to say, this isn't just about not having sex with your family members, right? If the Torah said, don't have sex with your mother, you might read that and say, well, of course I won't. But perhaps the Torah is saying, and perhaps the language of uncovering is, the Torah wants some kind of preservation of privacy and dignity and other kinds of sexual distancing, other kinds of either affection or visual, or sort of like visual awareness of one another, because those things can lead to sexual violation. So don't think you can get away with some kind of intimate physical affection with your family members, because it will lead to sexual intimacy. And so maybe my mother asked, why this language? Maybe the connection to the Noah story is to say, don't even go there. It is important not to see your family members naked. Again, we can debate all of this, but certainly we're talking about after puberty, right? Like, kids running around naked is not something that I can imagine condemning, and is not forbidden in our tradition. But after sexual maturity, it's important to have some kind of separation between brothers and sisters, between parents and children, because it could lead to these worst offenses. Okay, great. The other thing, though, that Ariella raises again is power dynamics and the way that the most powerful people in the family can subvert what Ariella sort of like in passing called the way things are supposed to be. And even though that phrase is a little aloof, what does it mean to say the way things are supposed to be? You do wonder if that's part of what the Torah, that there's a presumption that actually the Torah doesn't need to articulate, that no society needs to articulate, that you don't need to explain why you don't have sex with your parents. The Torah says, she's your mother. That's all the explanation you need. She's your mother. Of course you don't. Now, I don't know, does that require explanation or not? But that language that Ariella just used of the way things are supposed to be, maybe the Torah is, now I'm combining both thoughts that Ariella has offered. Maybe the Torah is overlaying, no pun intended, prohibitions on top of what the Torah presumes to be the obvious that everybody knows. All cultures are going to come to don't sleep with your parents or your children, but maybe we need more. Maybe we need some guidelines or protections around that to safeguard, to make sure that doesn't happen. Okay, let's continue. Leah?
This seems to me to be particular prohibition and nervousness around male genitalia. I mean, didn't we just read in previous sections about the priestly garments? I think this is a society where men and women were in sort of like a robe, one-piece dress. But the priests are specifically instructed to wear breeches or trousers so that their genitalia would not, there's some phrase about because Hashem doesn't want to see that. I imagine them going up and down the steps of the temple, and somehow their male genitalia needs to be covered, not so that other people don't see it, but that Hashem is not affronted by exposure to that.
Okay, it's like there's a lot there. It's very hard to unpack that completely, but it's important that you raise some of these questions. The question of male nakedness, right? Because it's easy to read this passage as speaking to men and presuming that men want to sleep with women and just talking about women's bodies and women's nakedness. But that's why I emphasize that at the very first prohibition is don't uncover your father's nakedness, right? Your father's nakedness. And that's what Ham saw, is his father's nakedness. That's the first nakedness that we actually hear about in the Torah. I should say, some of you probably think, what about Adam and Eve and their nakedness? But actually there's a different word used for their nakedness. They were arum, which is more like they were just sort of in their natural state. But this is the word erva is first used with Noah, and it's a male gaze at a male genitalia, as you said. And I want to share the verse that there are a couple of verses that talk about the priests and their garments, but you're absolutely right, Leah. And I don't know exactly what to make of it, but we must consider, as you know, I'm having a hard time with my screen share today. Do not ascend my altar, God says, by steps, so that you do not, here's that same phrase, uncover your nakedness upon it. Lo tegale ervatcha. Here talking to the priests who ascend upon the altar. And Leah's right, there are other, I didn't include this on the source sheet, but there are other verses that describe the priestly garments as exactly like robes that would cover male genitalia, male nakedness. So I don't know exactly what to do with it, but it's striking because it isn't just about the male gaze at female bodies, but also the male gaze at male bodies, and Leah suggests maybe God's gaze at male bodies, which is undesired. Okay, interesting. Rabbi Zaki.
Okay, I'm going somewhere different. I think it's
Okay.
about uncovering one's soul. So our skin is what covers us, but if somebody delves deeper into our soul and gets to know us when we're not ready to share that, so it's not about the physical body, it's about the essence of our soul. Even though I know the text was talking about who not to sleep with and everything else, but it all affects our souls.
Okay, yeah. I mean, so let's. I realize now we're close to the end of our hour. So, no, but that's great. That's great. I mean, this is actually a good place to begin to summarize, because we have been considering what it means. My mother's question sort of forced us to consider, what does it mean that it's all about non-uncovering? And Rabbi Zaki suggests, like, So as we asked that question, we wondered if it wasn't just about sex, but actually all manner of seeing too much, revealing too much. Rabbi Zaki takes it to like a spiritual place. Like, what does it mean to invade someone's privacy on a spiritual level, to see too much of them? And the Noah story evokes that as well. That is, if we don't follow Rashi and the Talmud and assume that Ham raped his father, which that there's reason to make that association, there's something that Ham seems to have done to Noah that shamed him, that violated his privacy, but not just privacy like in the standard way. The moment when Noah was at his lowest, the moment when he was drunk and miserable and grieving the loss of all humanity. And just imagine him in his tent, just twirling around naked, pathetic, crying, who knows what state he was in. And his son went in there and not just saw it, but went and told his brothers, look at what dad is doing. Look at what dad looks like. Look at what a fool dad is, dancing around naked. Who knows, like, whether he was talking, maybe I saw my parents masturbating. I could, or just like on a spiritual level. There's the physical nervousness here, but there's also, Rabbi Zaki suggests, there's a kind of spiritual nervousness of just violating someone's sense of personal integrity. And it's so easy to do that in a family. It's so easy to do that. You're in close quarters. You know, we get in fights with each other. We say things to each other that we wouldn't say to anyone else. And, you know, most of the time, you know, maybe Ariel is right. It's just our natural instincts prevent us from violating them in physical ways, but it happens and it causes damage, destruction to the body and the soul. And so the Torah is nervous about that. The Torah worries about that. We are at time and there's more to be done here. If you look at the source sheet, part of what I started to do was to think a little bit about the role of alcohol in the Noah story. And then in other stories in the Torah, Lot's daughters, now this is interesting, Lot's daughters rape their father and they get him drunk to do it. Right? The book of Leviticus warns priests about covering their garments, warns priests about getting drunk. And here the book of Leviticus is warning all of us to maintain some kind of covering. And why does the book of Leviticus do that? I'll just end on this quote here, because I think it's worth giving us some classic Levitical language. The book of Leviticus says, drink no other wine or intoxicant, you or your sons, when you enter the tent of meeting, so that you may not die. This is a law of time throughout the ages. For you must distinguish between the sacred and the profane, the holy and the profane, between the impure and the pure. And you must teach the Israelites all the laws which God has imparted to them through Moses. Now, we use those words, you know, we toss around those words a lot, the pure and the impure, the holy and the unholy. And I don't know if we really understand those words. And I don't think we've really understood the depth of what exactly the Torah is doing and we've raised a lot of good questions and we've offered a lot of good interpretations. But I do think that it's important to remember that this appears in the context of the book of Leviticus, whose chief concerns are holiness and purity. What do those terms even mean? But goodness, they certainly seem to apply in these cases. It's hard for me to fully speak out why incest is wrong, but there does seem to be something unholy, something impure about it. So much more investigation to be done. We've only begun to scratch the surface, but good work today on this very, very challenging and yet very prominent and significant topic in our tradition. Sorry to the folks I didn't get to. By the way, today is the 12th day of the Omer, if you're counting, and I guess that's about it. One more thing. I am beginning a class on Pirkei Avot on Monday night at 6 o'clock. We do this